Let's start with the Netflix series, Adolescence. At its core, it tells the story of Jamie, a young man navigating a deeply isolating world that feels like it's designed to trap him. And honestly, in some ways, it is. You see, Jamie's journey is shaped by more than just the usual struggles of adolescence. He's pulled into digital spaces, algorithm driven echo chambers that almost seem to conspire against him, pushing rigid ideas of what it means to be a man. These spaces glorify dominance, hyper individualism, essentially a version of masculinity that leaves no room for vulnerability or connection. Now, as Jamie retreats further into these curated digital ecosystems, you start to see how the algorithms don't just reflect his insecurities, they amplify them. And they're not impartial bystanders, not at all. Social media platforms, in their quest to keep users engaged, prioritize content that's polarizing and emotionally charged. For Jamie, that means being fed a steady stream of influencers, each reinforcing this caricature of manhood, unflinching, unyielding, and above all, dominant. What's really striking is how the show frames this as a feedback loop. Jamie's growing alienation pushes him deeper into these spaces, and the more time he spends there, the more he begins to question his own identity. Is he failing some kind of test of masculinity? Is he weak, or as he fears, being labeled something even worse? The stigma around labels like incel only adds fuel, creating a storm of defensiveness and confusion. It's like this spiral that I think feels uncomfortably familiar for many young men today. And if we zoom out, Jamie's world starts to look less like fiction and more like a reflection of our own. Masculinity in digital spaces is being engineered, shaped by algorithms that prioritize profit over well-being. It's not just about individual struggles like Jamie's. This is systemic. The digital architecture itself creates the conditions for these harmful feedback loops. It amplifies insecurities, reinforces rigid norms, and isolates individuals just when they most need connection. The implications, honestly, are staggering. By keeping these norms alive and profitable, platforms are essentially trapping men in a cycle of frustration and alienation. And so, when you think about how technology intersects with identity, it's clear this isn't accidental, it's engineered. When we start to think about masculinity beyond the modern lens, we find that it's never been a fixed idea. Cultures across history have always had distinct interpretations of what it means to be a man. Masculinity as a construct is dynamic by nature. It's shaped by the needs and values of a society. Take ancient Greece, for instance. Now, what's fascinating about ancient Greece is the sheer plurality of masculinities that existed within its culture. The Athenians, for example, placed a premium on oratory skill and political participation. For them, manhood was tied to intellect and civic engagement. Meanwhile, the Spartans, they operated on an entirely different framework. Their focus was on discipline and physical strength, a kind of martial masculinity that celebrated a warrior ethos at its core. And then you have the Stoics, who steered the conversation in yet another direction, highlighting inner virtue, self-control, and philosophical thought as the pinnacle of manhood. But here's the thing, none of these models existed in isolation. They overlapped, they informed one another, and they ultimately reflected the particular challenges and values of their respective societies. And if you think about it, this diversity in masculinity isn't just a relic of history, it's mirrored in our present day. Today, for example, some of the age-old fighting virtues like resilience or discipline are being reinterpreted. They now sit alongside qualities such as emotional intelligence and cooperation. You start to see a shift happening, a slow redefinition of strength that isn't solely tied to physical or economic dominance, but also embraces, almost equally, nonviolent expressions of power and connection. It's that fluidity, that constant adaptation of masculinity, that creates space for growth, even while historical constructs linger in the background. And we can't ignore how modern masculinity evolves in reaction to external factors. A society under threat, whether real or perceived, often leans into the more rigid and traditional aspects of masculinity as a sort of defense mechanism. In fact, in the shadow of 9/11, masculinity in America underwent an almost seismic shift. If we trace its roots, one key turning point sticks out: Osama bin Laden's 2002 letter to America. This letter wasn't just a manifesto, it became almost indirectly a kind of cultural provocation. You see, the United States didn't just respond militarily, it responded ideologically with a full throated embrace of a warrior like identity. Masculinity itself began to take on these rigidly defined, hyper patriarchal tones. And here's where it gets critical to understand. This wasn't a linear change, right? Masculinity began to transform into something rooted in defiance. It became reactive, a depiction that demanded toughness, strength, even dominance, as though those traits alone could fend off vulnerability or perceived threats. And while this image of manhood was, in part, a repudiation of extremist narratives like bin Laden's, it also ended up echoing some of those very same grievance driven frameworks. It fostered this sense of constant siege, of needing to prove oneself against the odds, which, when you think about it, is a pretty heavy burden to carry. Fast forward to today, and what you might not expect is how this discourse has found new life, especially online. On platforms like TikTok, bin Laden's letter has resurfaced, reigniting debates about its content and the cultural identity it once provoked. The conversation has turned into, well, something more contentious and fragmented. And these fragments, as these bite-sized videos and hot takes, kind of distort the historical context. They risk flattening out the nuance and amplifying the most polarizing aspects, especially to younger audiences who weren't even around when these events first unfolded. But this raises broader questions, doesn't it? Questions about how resilient these old frameworks of masculinity really are, particularly in the face of today's realities. It's almost as though we're stuck trying to reconcile a version of manhood forged in a different time and place with a vastly changed world. A world where the conditions, the job stability, the economic systems, even the social expectations are nothing like the ones that masculinity was originally built around. And yet we still hold on to or even revere this past model. Why? It's, I think, this tension, holding on to ideals that don't quite fit the present, that shapes so much of the frustration we see, especially among young men. They're left trying to embody a kind of self-sufficient, battle-ready masculinity without the infrastructure to support it. So when we talk about young men today and the challenges they face, it's hard to ignore the weight of the expectations placed on them. This idea that if you work hard enough, if you keep your head down and push through, you'll eventually succeed. It sounds almost aspirational. But the reality? It's just not that simple anymore. We're living in an economic landscape that's fundamentally different from the one where these ideals were born. Decades ago, self-sufficiency wasn't some kind of unattainable dream. It was supported by things like strong unions, affordable housing, and stable jobs. There were systems in place that made it possible to build a life, to feel secure. But today, those systems have eroded, faded, if they're even still there at all. Take housing, for example. The cost of living has skyrocketed, especially in urban centers where job opportunities are concentrated. And it's not just housing, it's healthcare, it's education, it's the basic building blocks of stability. Young men are being handed this script, right? A script that tells them to man up and achieve independence, but the tools to do so, they're just missing. It's like being told to build something, but being handed the wrong set of tools, And then there's the job market. Even though we have jobs, we don't have the same kind of jobs. Jobs that provide clear pathways to growth or that match the stability earlier generations had. So many of the opportunities available now feel kind of precarious. Gig work, short-term contracts, it's no wonder there's frustration. You can work as hard as possible and still feel like you're barely scraping by. But here's where it gets even more complicated. This disconnect between expectations and reality, it's not just frustrating, it's downright alienating. Young men internalize these feelings, questioning themselves, their worth, their abilities, and all of this is happening in a society that still largely holds on to this myth of meritocracy. The idea that if you fail, it's because you didn't try hard enough. It's because you personally fell short, not because the system itself is failing you. Honestly, though, how could they not feel alienated? They're told to carry the same self sufficiency ideals of the past while struggling in an economic environment that doesn't support those ideals anymore. If we're serious about tackling the challenges young men face today, then we need to start by identifying the systemic failures shaping how they perceive themselves. And this isn't about pointing fingers at individuals or even at vague societal changes. It's about looking at the structures, the language we use, the environments we create, even the media we consume, that all contribute to these rigid, often outdated frameworks of masculinity. Let's consider language, for example. Terms like toxic masculinity were originally meant to spotlight certain harmful behaviors, but now their overuse has started to, well, alienate the very people these conversations were supposed to engage. People hear those words and think they're being blamed or judged. So, what if we shifted the language instead? What if we emphasized traits like empathy, humility, or adaptability, not as exceptions to masculinity, but as core elements of it? It's small shifts like these that can create room for men to feel understood rather than attacked, room for collaboration instead of conflict. And then there's the digital world where things get, honestly, even trickier. Social media platforms, as they're currently designed, prioritize engagement over ethics. What does that mean? It means algorithms, those invisible forces shaping what we see online, often push polarizing content to the forefront. For young men, this reinforces narrow, harmful narratives about what masculinity should look like. But here's the thing: we can redesign these spaces. We can create algorithms that amplify diverse voices, that encourage critical thinking instead of trapping users in echo chambers. It's not easy, sure, but it's not impossible either. Thoughtful design can change how these platforms influence identity. Let's move beyond just the digital and talk about, well, the physical and communal spaces, or lack thereof. Public spaces where men can gather and bond meaningfully are disappearing. Maybe it's because of privatization, maybe it's worries about surveillance, but the result is the same: less connection. What we need is a revival, really. Community centers, mentorship programs, maker spaces, places where men can build relationships that aren't just about competition or status. These spaces could foster a sense of belonging, of shared purpose, without reinforcing outdated norms. And honestly, what's key in all of this is being intentional, pragmatic even, about how we approach these changes. These ideas aren't just theoretical, they're actionable. Programs like the Roots of Empathy initiative in schools, or even as simple as father and baby meetups, are showing the value of integrating emotional intelligence into development. It's proof that we don't have to start from scratch. Productive efforts already exist. What we need is to amplify and adapt them. But these interventions, while necessary, they only work if they address both the immediate and underlying issues. Language, digital design, and social spaces, they're all part of a bigger picture. So here we are at the end of this conversation. And I think it's become increasingly clear: masculinity, as a construct, is not something static. It's dynamic, it's evolving, and in many ways, it's struggling to find its footing in the modern world. The models of dominance and hyper-individualism that once served as benchmarks, they're just no longer sustainable, not if we're aiming for a society that values collaboration, mutual respect, and, ultimately, connection. But this isn't a challenge that young men can navigate alone, and it's definitely not one they should have to. What we need is, well, an all-hands-on-deck approach. Families, schools, workplaces, media creators, every single layer of our societal fabric plays a role in reshaping what masculinity can and should look like. It's not about tearing down what exists. It's about building something better, something healthier, piece by piece. And honestly, the call to action here isn't some grand, sweeping revolution, though that might sound tempting. No, it's about taking practical, intentional steps. It's about rethinking the language we use, redesigning the spaces where connection happens, both digital and physical, and broadening the narratives we tell about what it means to be a man. Because the reality is, we are all impacted by these constructs, directly or indirectly, and that makes this deeply personal for everyone. At the end of the day, masculinity isn't something we need to overcome or eliminate, it's something we need to reinterpret. It should reflect the realities of today, the challenges we face, and the kind of society we want to build together. And it's not an individual goal, it's a collective one that's built brick by brick, not just by the men of today or those shaping them, but by everyone invested in a better, more connected future. And that's all for today. Thanks for listening and for thinking critically along with me. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and let's keep reimagining what's possible together.